Welcome. My name is LJ Stanbrook. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council. We have a treat today. We have a great guest speaker, distinguished speaker, all the way from New Zealand. Thank you so very much, Anne, for joining us from New Zealand. We would like to hear from you when we turn and talk to you a little bit about how is it in New Zealand? What does it look like? We understand that you're coronavirus free. So if you can start your presentation, we would be very interested to hear about the conditions in New Zealand. So thank you for being here. As you all know, the World Affairs Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We promote knowledge of international relations and global understanding. This is so important today for democracy to work. You have to have informed citizens, and the international affairs and the situation, global affairs affect us all, as we see with this global pandemic that is hitting the whole world. Please note that your microphone will be on mute and your camera will be turned off for the duration of the presentation. To submit a question at any time, please do use the question and answer box in the Zoom toolbar, and you can see it on the slide where it is. Do not put your questions in the chat box, put it in the question and answer toolbar, please. This presentation will be recorded and we will send it out to you via the World Affairs Council mailing list. So please make sure that you're signed up to receive our emails. If by any chance you enjoyed today's free digital program, please consider making a financial gift to help support our mission, our education mission at www.worldaffairscharlotte.org/giving. Thank you. So Anna Fifield is the Beijing Bureau Chief for the Washington Post, covering all aspects of Greater China. She was the Post's Bureau Chief in Tokyo between 2014 and 2018, focusing Japan and the Koreas, but periodically reporting from other parts of the region. And particularly concentrated on North Korea, trying to shed light on the lives of ordinary people there, and also on how the regime managed to stay in power. She's the author of The Great Successor, The Divinely Perfect Destiny of Brilliant Comrade Kim Jong Un. She started as a journalist in her home country of New Zealand and then worked for the Financial Times for 13 years. During her times there, she reported from almost 20 countries, from Iran and Libya to North Korea and Australia. During the 2013-2014 academic year, she was a Nieman Journalism Fellow at Harvard, studying how change happens in closed societies. So we're delighted to have with us today Anne Fifield from New Zealand, reporting on China and North Korea. Anne, please go ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, LJ, for that very kind introduction. And yes, hello everybody from New Zealand. I am usually based in Beijing, but today, well, for the past couple of months, because of the coronavirus, I have been here in New Zealand. I accidentally got shut out of China when I came on a short visit, so I will be returning to China as soon as they reopen the borders there. So today I am here to talk to you about North Korea and about Kim Jong Un in particular, a man who commands a lot of interest around the world. But I'm also happy to talk to you in the Q&A about the situation in New Zealand. As LJ said, we have had a lot of success in locking down and getting rid of the coronavirus. The whole country was pretty much closed for 7 weeks, but now we've had 6 whole days with no cases of coronavirus. So we're in a good situation here where life has gotten pretty much back to normal. But I'm also happy to talk about China. This week in particular has been an extremely big week in China news, because on Thursday, your time, China actually has basically ended the one country, two systems framework through which it has governed Hong Kong, which is a momentous change. And so if anybody wants to talk about China, of course, ask about that too. But for today, I will talk to you about Kim Jong Un, who I spent way too much time thinking about over the past few years in the course of writing this book about him. So It is not a biography. I don't call it a biography because we just don't know enough about him for anybody anywhere to write a biography. But what I wanted to do was to kind of pull together all the available information about him and to paint the most complete portrait possible of this man who looms so large over world affairs. When Kim Jong Un became the leader of North Korea in 2011, he was 27 years old. He was extremely inexperienced and unqualified to do the job of running a totalitarian state, the world's only communist dynasty. And there was a lot of skepticism about his ability to do it, to keep intact this regime that probably should have collapsed years or decades previously. So much smarter people than me in Washington, D.C. had predicted that he wouldn't be able to do it. But I also thought that he would not be able to do it because I had been visiting North Korea for some years and during his father's time. And I'd seen just how broken the system was and how repressive it was, how the economy did not function at all. And I just couldn't imagine that the 80-year-old generals of this regime would tolerate a 27-year-old giving them orders, and that Kim Jong Un would be able to kind of sustain the lie of the North Korean regime and its claim to be the legitimate leaders of North Korea. But so imagine my surprise when I returned in 2014 for the first time in 6 years. That was when I joined the Washington Post, and I went back into North Korea, the first visit of Kim Jong Un's era, and I saw that Pyongyang was actually looking quite good. I mean, Pyongyang is this Potemkin village where the North Korean regime, the elites live, and where the regime tries to show its best face to the outside world. But still, even for a Potemkin village, the facade was looking better than ever. So Kim Jong Un had managed to build these, order the construction of skyscrapers. Basically, it kind of looked like a third-tier Chinese city with how it had managed to give itself a bit of a facelift and develop, and there were cafes and supermarkets and things that had not existed previously. So these really were things just for the elite. You had to have money and be part of the system to be able to go to these places. But still, even this one little slice of North Korea that I was allowed to see did look like it was getting better. So I set out to report kind of how Kim Jong Un had been able to do this, how he'd been able to both stay in power and also to make it look like life in North Korea was getting better. And I did this, I'm a reporter, and so I reported it out. I set out trying to meet as many people as I could who had lived in North Korea under Kim Jong Un. So I went looking for many people who'd escaped from North Korea in the previous couple of years, very recent defectors from North Korea. But I also set out to find every person who had ever met Kim Jong Un. And at the beginning in particular, no encounter was too trivial for me to hunt that person down. So I found people in South Korea who'd met him for just like 10 seconds at his father's funeral, and other people who'd known him as a child. I tracked down his aunt and uncle who had defected to the United States in 1998. And I set out to try to paint a picture of how Kim Jong Un had done this. And a big part of my motivation was to try to show, I think, that he was no joke. Because he had, there's a perception in the outside world that he is this kind of cartoon character dictator with the funny hair and the funny outfits and, launches 1,000 memes on the internet. But really, I mean, and I admit Kim Jong Un does lend himself to caricature, as as the cover of my book shows as well. But I wanted to show that we should be taking him seriously, because he had managed to defy the expectations about him and stay in power. So when I looked at how he had done that, I discovered he had been kind of very strategic and ruthless and rational in the way he had approached the task of taking control of this regime. And during 2017 in particular, but also earlier, we had many politicians across the spectrum in the United States suggesting that he was crazy. I mean, most famously, President Trump called him a total nut job, but other people had said that he was irrational. General McMaster had said that he couldn't be deterred, that strategic deterrence would no longer work. John McCain also called him that crazy kid. So there was a lot of, conventional wisdom was that he was crazy. But I discovered he was anything but crazy. And let me lay out to you why I concluded that he was a rational actor and somebody who could be deterred. And that was, so when he became the leader of North Korea, he was 27 years old. There was very little preparation for him to take over. His grandfather had spent 25 years for Kim II, preparing Kim II to take over, but Kim Jong Un had had only 3 years to be introduced to the regime and to learn the ropes of the system. But he very quickly, he used the institutional knowledge of the system there to learn how it worked. So for example, there was the army chief, the propaganda chief, and in particular his own uncle, whose name was Jang Song-taek, who was this economic whiz who was in charge of relations with China and was responsible for a lot of the economic development, such as there is, but a lot of commercial ties between North Korea and China. So those people, the three of them walked around the hearse at Kim Jong-il's funeral and were there present at the very top of the regime. But once Kim Jong-un had used their institutional knowledge and figured out how to run the regime, he got rid of all of them in very quick succession. So the head of the army was purged, never seen again. The head of the propaganda department also just disappeared. We never heard what happened to him. But Kim Jong-un's uncle, Jang Song-taek, was very famously humiliated, literally dragged out of a Politburo meeting, denounced as a traitor to the system, and summarily executed a few days later. And this is a 2013, 2 years into Kim Jong-un's reign, this sent a very powerful message to the other people in the system to say, don't mess with me. Nobody in this system is safe from Kim Jong-un and his ruthlessness. Even family members can be sent literally to the, well, not literally, but it can be sent to the chopping block, can be executed and dispatched within that way. So I think this was a very powerful message from Kim Jong-un right at the get-go, where he showed that he was very much in control and ruthless and prepared to get rid of anybody who could rival him for the leadership of North Korea, who could develop their own power base. And so that was one thing that he did early on, which clearly, does not make him a nice guy. But if you are a ruthless dictator wanting to stay in power, this is straight from the dictator's playbook of how to do that. So that was the kind of the brutal side of his kind of personnel approach, if you could put it that way. And then the other side of that was that he allowed the people who did remain loyal to him in the regime to become very rich. There is now a lot of corruption in North Korea. those skyscrapers that I saw on my first visit back in 2014 were all built by the military and through military contracts, on which people, the bosses are taking a cut from everything. And this kind of wealth is very obvious to see now inside North Korea, in Pyongyang, where people have been able to become rich and corrupt on the sides of their official jobs, whether it's in the military or in ministries or in trading for the regime. And so in North Korea, these are called masters of money. They are kind of the oligarchs of North Korea. And so these people who've really emerged under Kim Jong Un have more reason than ever to support his regime, to be loyal to him, because they know that if North Korea was to collapse, or if they were to escape to South Korea, they would not be the fat cats. They would not be the elite. They would, possibly be driving a taxi in Seoul like other escapees there. So they have a real incentive to keep the system intact there. So these two moves of kind of coddling the elite and very publicly punishing potential rivals were key parts of Kim Jong Un's strategy for taking over at the beginning there. And just kind of to skip ahead a few years, but on that first idea of getting rid of potential rivals, this very spectacularly was shown in 2017 when Kim Jong Un ordered the assassination of his own half-brother. You'll probably remember that Kim Jong-nam, the firstborn son of this generation, and therefore, according to Confucian hierarchy, it should have been him that was the leader. But he had been in exile for some 15 years, showed no interest whatsoever in leading the regime, but Kim Jong-un had him smeared with a chemical weapon in Kuala Lumpur airport, and he died a very fast and gruesome death there. Again, Kim Jong-un showing no one is safe, but also showing that no one is safe anywhere, that he can send his people to get rid of potential rivals no matter where they are in the world, and he will do it in a public place with impunity. So again, that was a very pointed message that he was sending. He could have done it in a much more subtle way with no fingerprints leading back to him, but he chose not to. Okay, so that's the personnel side. Moving on to the other kind of two-track approach, I think, that Kim Jong-un pursued, and that is the one that is called Byongjin in North Korea. That is the parallel development program that Kim Jong-un announced in 2013, where he said that North Koreans will never have to tighten their belts again. He pronounced economic, they don't call it reform in North Korea because that suggests that there's something wrong with the system, and clearly it's a perfect system according to Kim Jong-un. But he said there would be economic improvement plus the development of a nuclear weapons program. And this is something that his father had been pursuing. North Korea conducted its first nuclear weapons test in 2006, but they hadn't made much progress. Those last few bombs were real fizzles. And there was, concern, but also a little bit of laughing about how minuscule North Korea's attempts were to build this bomb. But Kim Jong-un defied all of these expectations. It took him a few years, and there were many bumps along the way. There were rockets that didn't launch, and the first few nuclear tests were kind of uninspiring or unimpressive in terms of not advancing the capability much more. But then in 2017, Kim Jong-un showed very rapid progress in the nuclear weapons program. So that was the year that we saw a quick succession of missile launches culminating on Independence Day, July the 4th, 2017, in the successful launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile. And this was a missile that is technically capable. They shot it straight up, and then so it came straight back down. They did not test it on its normal trajectory because that would have sent it to the United States. But from what they did test, it showed that it was technically capable of reaching the mainland United States. And within a few months, they would show they could reach everywhere. So right to the East Coast, right to Charlotte, North Carolina. This was a huge and alarming development. At the same time, they were testing nuclear weapons, which again culminated in 2017 with the detonation of what appeared to be a hydrogen bomb. This was this nuclear test that they did at their known test site, where the seismic kind of reading from this showed that it was a hydrogen bomb or a thermonuclear weapon that was 17 times the size of the explosion at Hiroshima. So huge and very, very alarming. And so for Kim Jong Un, this was obviously a source of great pride. And for him, it achieved two kind of goals at the same time. And that clearly it made the United States really pay attention to him in a way that they hadn't before then. This is when President Trump started talking about raining down fire and fury on the North Korean regime, really very powerful rhetoric, a lot of concern in the region that President Trump would launch some kind of military action against North Korea. But because North Korea had demonstrated this capability and the possibility of retaliation against any strike, the situation in Northeast Asia became extremely tense for that time. So North Korea managed to develop a very clear deterrent capability there, and also capture American attention like never before. As all of these tests, of course, were accompanied by these videos showing, photoshopped nuclear weapons raining down on Manhattan, on the Capitol, very, very incendiary stuff. But at the same time, and this is something that is really often overlooked about the nuclear program, is that this was a great source of national pride inside North Korea. I distinctly remember talking to this young guy who was a science student at university in North Korea, and he really hated the regime. He told me he was disgusted by it, and he defected from the regime for that reason. But even he said that he remembers in science class at university, physics class, learning about how nuclear fission worked and being like immensely proud that his country, which was so backwards in so many ways, was able to do this phenomenal thing, and particularly able to do this thing that Japan and South Korea had not been able to do. So I think that the program has been a way for Kim Jong Un to engender a sense of national pride inside North Korea, and thereby boost his legitimacy, boost his claim to be the rightful leader of this North Korean regime. So that's one plank of this two-track strategy that Kim Jong Un set out. And the other was economic development. He said, painted very clearly a picture of a brighter future for North Koreans. And I think he did this for a reason, and that was that he was 27 years old when he took over. If he wanted to remain the leader of North Korea for decades to come, into his 70s or 80s like his grandfather and father, then he could not just hold on for dear life like his father did. He actually had to show an improvement in the standard of living in North Korea under his leadership. And so the way that he has done this, and he has done this to some degree, was to allow market forces to unfold in North Korea in a way that they hadn't ever before. So he has allowed the proliferation of marketplaces, recognizable kind of private markets, private entrepreneurship in North Korea. So at the extreme end, this is the corrupt officials in Pyongyang who are on the take, on the side of their, making money through their business, partly for the regime, partly for themselves. But at a grassroots level as well, people in North Korea have been able to go to earn their own living in a way that they never have before. So now in these marketplaces around North Korea, right into the small towns on the border and things, you can find very busy marketplaces where, for example, people might be cutting hair or selling tofu that they've made at home. They might have worked their way up so that they're selling rice cookers or vacuum cleaners that they have imported from China. You know, there's a lot of entrepreneurship inside North Korea, so that pretty much everybody is involved in market activity in some way. You know, I've interviewed doctors who technically work at the hospital, but in fact they are looking for medicinal herbs that they are then selling in the market or exporting to China. You know, teachers don't show up to teach school anymore because they are busy working as traders in this new market economy. So this is a really big change. This is the single biggest change in North Korea in 70 years, and the way that Kim Jong Un has allowed people to make their own living and in reality become less dependent on the state because the state can't provide for them anymore. There are still a lot of limits on this. There's a lot of activity that is not allowed, but you know, but by the same token, if you are caught, for example, with South Korean dramas on a USB stick or something like that, you can bribe your way out of a lot of these economic crimes in North Korea. And this kind of easing up on the economy has led to very tangible changes in North Korea. So at the extreme end, as I've said, this is the loyalists in Pyongyang who are getting rich under Kim Jong Un. But even for normal people, if they have become active in the markets there, they have experienced some improvement in their standard of living. Kim Jong Un, of course, takes all the credit for this, but it's really under their own steam that they have done this. And I think, you know, Kim Jong Un has not done this because he cares about the North Korean people. We know that he definitely does not know about the does not care about the North Korean people, but he knows that pretty much everybody in North Korea has now watched media from the outside world, whether it be Korean dramas from the South or Chinese action films. There's a lot of information penetration in North Korea right now. So I think Kim Jong Un knows that in order to sustain his leadership, he has to give people a sense that their lives are improving and kind of on a trajectory where they may one day catch up with perhaps China, but not North Korea. Not South Korea. I think this reason, this sense of economic improvement, is a huge driver for why Kim Jong Un agreed in 2018 to come into the outside world and to hold all of these meetings with world leaders. Notably, he's met President Trump 3 times now. And so he wanted to do that partly for legitimacy. You know, he is now the first North Korean leader to ever meet a sitting American president. And that year, you know, he met Xi Jinping from China, Vladimir Putin, South Korean President Moon Jae-in, and President Trump now on 3 occasions, which enabled him to present himself as an international statesman, a responsible nuclear leader, just like the others. Not Moon Jae-in, but just like President Trump and President Xi and President Putin there. So this is very much part of his strategy. But I think he really needs the sanctions that were imposed in 2016 as a result of those nuclear tests and missile tests. He really needs those to be lifted if he is going to see a big improvement in the economy in North Korea, because these sanctions have had a very crippling effect. They've cut off all of North Korea's main sources of income, seafood exports, labor, and mineral exports to China in particular. So he's really needing that to happen. And the coronavirus outbreak has only worsened that situation. North Korea was the first country to shut its borders. It closed it off in January when the virus was spreading still in China. and it's been pretty much closed ever since. And so that 90% of North Korea's trade goes to or through China. So the fact that they have closed their borders in this way for almost half a year now will only compound their economic problems and their isolation. So before I break, I will just say that, address Kim Jong Un's absence over the past few months. There was a lot of speculation about his whereabouts in April after he missed his grandfather's, the celebration of his grandfather's birthday, the most important day of the North Korean year. We don't know what happened. We may never know what happened. It's possible that he had some kind of heart incident. When we look at him, we can see that he is not in great physical shape for a 36-year-old man. But I think probably he was social distancing, that this was probably related to the coronavirus in North Korea to avoid infection. So I think that's the most likely explanation. North Korea is pretty good at social distancing at the best of times, but probably we will not know. But bottom line, I think Kim Jong Un appears to be very stable and confident in his leadership in North Korea, and there are no signs of any kind of fissures in the regime right now. So with that, I will wrap up and pass over to Rena. So thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Anna, thank you so much for such a fascinating conversation on a very interesting regime. So everybody, please send in your questions. It's the Q&A box on your laptop or on your iPad. And I'm going to kick off with a question that's come through the system, but also part of what I was going to ask was, so Anna, based off of your closing comments, will we ever know when he actually dies? And if that happens, who is next in line?
Yeah, great question. We will know when he dies. The North Korean regime will announce it, probably as they did when his father and grandfather died. And both of them, it took a few days for it to be officially announced. And, probably we will not know until they actually announce it. The leadership question is very, very tightly held in North Korea, which is part of the reason I was so skeptical about these rumors over the past few months, because the initial source was through a defector network in South Korea. And while those networks are very helpful for information about things that people in the countryside in North Korea would know about, or the provincial cities, like how much they pay for rice in the market and local kind of Communist Party edicts, I do rely on a lot of those networks for that kind of information, but I just would not expect them to know anything about the leadership and especially the leader's health. So I had a lot of doubt about that. But yeah, so North Korea, I think they would have to eventually, they would have to tell China, they would have to announce it. But the question of succession remains a very open one in North Korea, because there is no clear successor. There is no heir apparent to Kim Jong Un. So even when he took over, his father announced 3 years earlier in 2009 that he had anointed his son. He started promoting Kim Jong Un up the ranks of the Workers' Party and the military. The propagandists started making up all of these stories about Kim Jong Un and presenting him as being qualified for the leadership. But there's just none of that now for anybody else. And the way the system is structured, the Kim family claims legitimacy by saying that they are kind of like deities, that they descended from this holy mountain in North Korea, and they have this mythical kind of special blood in their veins, and that makes them most qualified. So really it needs to be someone from the Kim family if they're going to maintain this myth. And there's no one apart from his younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, who you'll remember from the Olympics when she came to South Korea and became his envoy to the outside world. But she has two big problems. A, she's young. She's about 31 years old. And B, she's a woman. And in this very hierarchical Confucian system, a young woman really can't take over. This is a system that prizes age and maleness, and it was one thing for a young man to take over, but I just can't imagine that 80-year-old generals would accept taking orders from a 31-year-old woman. So it's a big problem. Kim Jong Un has children. I think he has 3 children. I think one of them is a boy. Maybe he's 5 years old, maybe younger, you know, not in any position to take over the leadership anytime soon. So I think if Kim Jong Un were to suddenly disappear, there would be a real power struggle, a real vacuum in North Korea. And yeah, the kind of power struggle that followed the death of Stalin. And speaking of which, if you haven't seen that movie, The Death of Stalin by Armando Iannucci, it is fantastic, and I can totally see that kind of jockeying going on inside North Korea. Back to you, Rena. Rena,
sorry about that delay. I just had to unmute. We are all challenged with technology in this COVID environment. So some interesting questions coming through, and I'm going to combine 2 of them. So if the North Korean regime were to fall, do South Koreans want to unite with the Korean Peninsula, or do they want to fend for themselves? And then the second part to that is there any propensity for a peace agreement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so on South Korea, no. This is a really generational issue inside South Korea, in that older South Koreans, and by that I mean maybe over 60, people who can remember the Korean War, or grew up in the shadow of that Korean War, their parents remembered it. These people may have a sense of kind of familial bond, or a sense that they are 2 parts of one country, and be more favorable to the idea of unification. But for younger generations and people who were alive and worked through South Korea's very rapid development into this kind of economic powerhouse we see today, or young people, people in their 20s, they do not identify with North Korea by and large anymore. They look at North Koreans as kind of country bumpkins who don't know, they defectors who arrive in South Korea. They don't know how to order a latte on their cell phone. You get engineers who've never used a computer before, never been on the internet. They really look at North Koreans as being quite backwards. And the surveys show that they are very unwilling to give up any of the economic gains that they have made through their own hard work over the past few decades in order to support North Korea. Because the collapse or the sudden unification of the 2 halves of the peninsula would really be a catastrophic event. It would be exponentially more difficult than the unification of Germany, because the gap is exponentially bigger now between these 2 parts of the peninsula. The South Korean economy is like 36 times the size of North Korea's. It would be extremely difficult. And so I think many people in South Korea favor a gradual approach. And this is really the main driver of the sunshine policy that progressives in South Korea have presented over the past few years. And that is aimed at building up North Korea from within and enabling their economy to get stronger, kind of propping them up in a way, so that when unification does eventually happen, that the gap won't be so big, and the task for South Korea won't be so huge. In terms of, and so I'm speaking general terms here, but those are played out overwhelmingly in surveys of South Koreans, and particularly young South Koreans don't wish for unification in any way at the moment. On the question of a peace treaty, This is something that North Korea has been pushing for a long time, for the reason, the Korean War ended in 1953 with an armistice, not a peace treaty. So that means technically to this day that they are, the US and South Korea are technically still at war with North Korea. And it was the United States that signed this armistice agreement on behalf of South Korea at the UN command in 1953. So the US really has a big role to play in here. The reason North Korea wants a peace treaty, or the biggest part of that reason, is because then there would be no reason for the United States to continue basing its military in South Korea. So this has been a way for North Korea to get rid of this huge military presence in the South. And that has never really been an option. Successive presidents have always said that the US needs a military contingent there in the South to be able to protect its ally from the North. But things have really changed under President Trump. Even before this diplomatic process with North Korea, President Trump was asking why the United States was paying and so much money and supporting, defending its rich allies in Japan and in South Korea, and had really voiced a lot of support for ending that. In South Korea, this is kind of a divisive issue. There are older people in particular, and conservatives definitely want the US military to remain. They think that the US is really necessary to defend South Korea against the North, that its nuclear umbrella is needed. But more and more younger people are willing to countenance this idea, at least, of a US withdrawal. The government does not. So I think, that this would be a really big change. But the emergence of President Trump has actually made this a relevant kind of topic of discussion now. This has been discussed. President Trump has said he's willing to sign a peace treaty, but the details of that would really need to be worked out. But I think, it should be signed. It's more than 70 years. Almost 70 years since the Korean War ended, and it's anachronistic that this war technically continues to this day. So thank you for the question. I'll hand back to Rena now.
Okay, so this is a follow-up to the peace treaty, but really shifting to the nuclear technology side of things. So the question is, what is the likelihood of North Korea selling nuclear weapons or technologies to others? Is this a threat that they could use as a bargaining chip?
Yeah, great question. So North Korea in the past has proliferated its weapons. We have seen them exporting missile technology in particular. And this is a big concern from the outside world. The kind of framework that has governed the approach to North Korea's nuclear program, and I guess the kind of minimum that the US could accept, and definitely China could accept, it's called the 3 no's, which is no more nukes, no better, so no progress, and no proliferation, no exporting any of this technology overseas. We've seen a couple of incidences where North Korea has been trying to sell missile parts in particular to allies, like Syria, for example, is thought to be a beneficiary of this. Years ago, there was some cooperation between Iran and North Korea on this. But really, one of the surprising things is that North Korea hasn't been caught doing much in the way of illicit trading in recent years. In the 90s and 2000s, there were lots of cases where North Koreans were caught counterfeiting super dollars, United States dollars, very good copies there, counterfeiting cigarettes. There were North Korean diplomats caught in Bulgaria with a trunk full of heroin, rhino horns. There's been all sorts of illegal trading that's gone on, but not much of it has been found under Kim Jong Un. And probably that is because they have developed more legal ways to make money. Part of that is the exports of people. They've been sending a lot of workers into the outside world. There are now North Korean lumberjacks in Russia and North Korean women working in factories in China. But across the world, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, there have been a lot of labor exports where the North Korean regime may be earning $500 million, $1 billion a year through this. Also from seafood exports to China, through coal exports. So they've developed ways to make money more legally. The other thing that they've done is really beef up their cyber capability. So they now have this very sophisticated army of cyber warriors who have been able to cause a lot of destruction. They have launched ransomware attacks, the WannaCry ones most notably, but also in one move that could be traced back to the North Koreans, they stole $81 million from the Central Bank of Bangladesh in a very kind of audacious hack before it was discovered. So they've gotten a lot better at these kinds of things. And so they haven't needed, I think, to do the proliferation so much. But having said that, it does remain an ongoing concern and something that China in particular would be very unhappy about. Rena?
Okay, so thank you, Anna, for that. So let's switch to the economy and to agriculture. So this is a great question coming from LJ. And the question is, agriculture and food distribution is the Achilles heel of North Korea due to lack of arable soil and non-modern agriculture methodology, and antiquated central directed food distribution system. How does and how will Kim Jong Un deal with this important issue?
Yeah, that's right. So food security has been a problem for North Korea ever since the division of the peninsula, because the north was known as the kind of industrial heartland, that's where the mines are, and the south was the breadbasket of the peninsula, or the rice bowl of the peninsula as they call it. So this has been an ongoing problem, exacerbated by the kind of mismanagement of the agricultural sector. There's been a lot of, like during the famine of the 90s, there was a lot of tree felling, there's a lot of erosion. North Korea has suffered a lot from floods over the years, and there was this very devastating famine in the 90s that killed maybe 1 million people in North Korea. So I think this is a big part of the reason why Kim Jong Un has embarked on a program, on a program of kind of economic slight opening, because he knows that the system can no longer supply food for the people of North Korea. They used to have a ration system, but that completely broke down. Almost nobody gets any food from the state anymore. People have to fend for themselves. And so by trading, they are able to buy their own food on the markets and sell, some of their agricultural production in the marketplaces, rather than sending it all to the central government for distribution. So this is a big change. Now we see, starvation is not a problem in North Korea anymore, but malnutrition really is. It remains rife, and so while people may get potatoes and rice, and if they're lucky, corn more likely, it's still very difficult, a really special treat to get meat or fish or other kinds of protein in North Korea. So there's a lot of deficiencies in the system. This remains an ongoing problem, and people are reliant on food from China in particular, a lot of exports there. To be able to survive. So that is, yeah, increasingly important. And maybe, I mean, I can see another question that's been asked there. Maybe I can just segue into that, which is, you know, can North Korea's economy survive without China? Really, no. You know, North Korea says that it is self-reliant, but it is not. It really depends on China. 90% of North Korea's trade goes to or through China, but a lot of what China sells as trade to North Korea is really aid in another way, that there is not a lot of, there is a lot that's sent to them without proper payment, or in like they barter for minerals there. So China is really critical to keeping North Korea afloat, which is why for years and years China has not really enforced sanctions against North Korea, because China just doesn't want North Korea to collapse. It's in China's interest to keep this allied state on its border stable and intact. The northern part of China, that northeastern area, is a very poor part and relatively undeveloped part of China, and they definitely do not want millions of hungry North Korean refugees flooding over that border and into a part of China which is kind of struggling by Chinese standards anyway. So they certainly do not want American troops in South Korea being able to move up the peninsula right to the Chinese border. So China has had a strong interest in keeping North Korea intact over the years. I think the reason why things became so tense in 2017 and why China did actually, for the first time ever, really implement United Nations sanctions was because they were worried that President Trump really would launch military action against North Korea, that he really would rain down fire and fury on North Korea. And so for that period, they enforced sanctions like never before, because they wanted to show the United States that sanctions could work, that there was no need for military action. But as soon as Donald Trump started talking to Kim Jong Un, that whole and maximum pressure ended. China stopped really enforcing those sanctions and allowed things to flow under the radar again. So China is critical, and to a lesser degree, but still important, Russia. A lot of the oil that goes into North Korea comes from Russia, and there is still quite a lot of trade that goes between the northern part of North Korea and the ports in the Vladivostok region of in the far east of Russia. So these two countries are have an interest there, a strategic interest, but also a kind of ideological interest in some ways. And President Putin has said, you know, North Koreans will eat grass before they cave in here. So, which they did do in the 90s during the famine. So they've both spoken out against sanctions and called for the sanctions imposed in 2016 to be lifted. Back to you, Rena.
So Anna, I'm going to pose the last two questions to you, and they're kind of similar. So the first one is, what are some of the interesting things you learned about Kim Jong Un during your book research that the public may not be aware of? And then secondly, how safe has it been for you to travel back and forth to North Korea?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to plug my book right there, because I hope there's a lot of tales about Kim Jong Un as a person in my book, and a lot of the stories I was able to uncover about his childhood and about how he has dealt with people since becoming the leader of North Korea. And, you know, many things that he has done and in his time as leader have been very brutal, and you know, this perception of him as ruthless and repressive is totally justified. But I think kind of one of the surprising things that I've learned about him during his tenure is he does have an ability to turn on the charm and to be self-deprecating. And, you know, we saw him at the summit with President Trump, that first one in Singapore, joking that that, you know, this is like something out of a science fiction movie, that people could not have imagined that these two leaders would be able to meet. And I spoke to the president of the International Olympic Committee, who went to Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong Un, and they watched a soccer game together. And Kim Jong Un laughed at him and made a joke and said, you know, it may not look like it, but I used to love playing sports when I was young. So he showed that he could, you know, anybody else in North Korea who joked about how fat Kim Jong Un was would be sent to a labor camp, or worse. But Kim Jong Un showed an ability to make a joke of himself and to address kind of the elephant in the room there. And that is, you know, something that is actually topical, because Kim Jong Un's weight is a concern, as we saw with his health. Has had health concerns, and they may have been a reason for some of his disappearances in the past. So I think he's shown himself to be unexpectedly capable of turning on the charm, and it's worked. You know, when we look at the way President Trump has talked about Kim Jong Un since those meetings, he's really defended him and acted as his best advocate in some way. He's explained away all the human rights abuses and presented Kim Jong Un as a smart cookie and someone who's able to be dealt with, which is kind of advertising the money couldn't buy. So I think that is one thing that I was surprised that he's been so savvy about it. And just very quickly, although I have been to North Korea many times, and I last went in 2016, I have not been since I started writing the book, and definitely not since I published the book. North Korea has rejected all of my most recent requests to go, which I take as a badge of honor. But certainly now that I've written a book about the leader, which is really the most sensitive aspect of North Korea, I would not go there. I think that it would be dangerous for me to go inside North Korea. So, so yeah, I look forward to going after the end of the North Korean regime, and I'll write about the next phase, I hope, for North Korea, whenever that may be. You know, who knows if that will be in my lifetime. So thank you so much for hosting me today, LJ and Rena, and everybody. Thanks for your great questions.
Thank you so very much. Thank you very much, Anne. This was so interesting. And I told you before the meeting started, the program started, I was in North Korea many years ago when Kim Il-sung was in charge, and it was the most amazing experience for a young person to experience North Korea. I'm sure it has changed since then, but probably not too much at all. So thank you for joining everyone and this afternoon's World Affairs Council Distinguished Speaker Series presentation with Anna Fifield, Beijing Bureau Chief of the Washington Post. She shared behind the scenes story of the rise and reign of Kim Jong Un, North Korea's president and elusive dictator. She's offered us insight into his penchant for political drama, his obsession with provoking the United States and others in the world with threats of nuclear missiles and war, and North Korea's status in the world. We learned a lot, as I said, and we would like to recommend to everyone to get your book if they're interested. It is available, and we have put it in our chat column. It is available on Amazon, and we have the link. The book is The Great Successor, the divinely, I can't read with my glasses on, the divinely perfect destiny of brilliant comrade Kim Jong Un. So please go to that link, and if by any chance you are an Amazon shopper, put World Affairs Council under Amazon Smile, and that's a way to help us as well in this time with some support. We would love to have you come to Charlotte. We will not need a visa, I think, or anything to be in Charlotte. We would love to continue our conversation about North Korea and about China when the conditions do allow for that. Thank you very much to Rena Arline, our board member and executive from Bank of America, and thank you all the people participating today, especially the board members of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you all for being with us today. We will see you next Thursday, and say hello to New Zealand for us. We'd love to be there with you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Enjoy your presentation.